Howdy and welcome to the F1 Hatchet. This is the driver rating for the Bahrain GP. This is a couple of weeks late, so we'll see how things play out, but I will have a rating for each of these drivers from last to first, from 1 to 10 on a rating scale, as 10 being the best and 1 being the worst, and we'll go from the end to the beginning. And these are all my opinions, and if you have a different opinion, you can leave your comments about those ratings in the comments. As we go through this list, they'll be rated between each teammate and how they qualified is included in this rating, as well as how bad their car is in the mix. So this has probably changed throughout the season, but I'm going to keep track and see how things progress. To start us off, we have Oscar Piastri. I gave a rating of 3.5 because he qualified 18th when his teammate qualified 11th. I know his car dropped out fairly early, so he didn't get a chance to shine to see how well he could have made up those positions. But with that qualifying so drastic between the two, he needs to really step up in his game. Next, we have Charles Leclerc, who dropped out on lap 41. He did qualify third, and he did a fairly good job. He ended up overtaking Perez for second for a short period of time and just held out on that third position until his car ran out and had that engine failure. So I ended up giving him a 9. He did about all he could in that race to progress as much as he could, giving him just beyond that first grid and holding out in general podium positions throughout the race until his car gave up. Then we have Esteban Ocon, who qualified 9th. So he did a decent qualifying job, but then he ended up 18th because of penalties. He had that penalty for starting position just to the right of the starting grid. He had the 10-second penalty for his team not correctly, solving that penalty from the grid. And then he had another 5-second penalty for speeding the pit lane. So I know he was just frustrated in that race, but he could have done a lot better as he had qualified 9th and his teammate was qualified 20th in that regard. So, and his teammate ended up in there in the 9th position as well. So at the final of the race. So I think he did not do a very good race at all. So I ended up giving him a 2. He could have probably had a worse, rating, except for that qualifying so much outpaced his teammate, as his teammate was 20th on the grid to start off with. Who knows if that's just bad timing or if that was more of, performance in that car, trying to get everything out of it. Then we come to Lando Norris. I gave him a 6. He did fairly well. It's hard to really gauge him on what he had performed. He did qualify 11th, which outqualified his teammate quite a bit. But that car had pneumatic issues. So he was coming into the pits quite often, 6 or 7 pit stops throughout the race, basically just using that as a test session for him. So coming in 17th position, just basically ahead of some of the people that were DNF'd, was not a whole lot of what he could do in that race. So I gave him just above average because he did a pretty good qualifying session. Then we have Guan Yu Zhou, who qualified 13th, just behind his teammate Bottas, which was fairly good, but then he ended up all the way down in 16th place for the end of the race. He did get the fastest lap, so I ended up giving him just below average as about 4.5. He should, that race with being up there with his teammate, he should have been up there with his teammate in that race final. And he showed he had the pace in the car with that fastest lap. He just probably had some issues with traffic, which threw him down into the back, having the issues with the tires and whatnot strategy. So I had to drop him down because of his final position relative to his teammate. Next, we have Nico Hulkenberg, who qualified 10th, which was excellent qualifying in that Haas vehicle, but he ended up down in 15th spot. So he outqualified his teammate quite a bit, but dropped back down and ended up being behind his teammate at the end of the race. So I ended up giving Nico a 6. He had a great, as I said, he had a great front, knocked that front wing plate. I don't know, maybe it should be a 7 with that in regard, but just could not hold out and ended up falling back into the field behind his teammate, who was on the only one in the alternate strategy. Then we have Nick DeVries, who I gave a 4.5. He qualified horribly in 19th spot when his teammate was actually 14th. So he could have made up a few spots there to start off with. And then he ended up in 14th position, so he didn't gain as many spots as he could have when his teammate ended up in 11th. So he's still making up some time there. So I think I ended up giving him a little bit less than average because he's fallen back into that field, not quite with his teammate in that regard. Then we come to the other Haas. We have Kevin Magnussen, who qualified 17th, which was horrible, but he ended up working his way back up to 13th, and that was ahead of his teammate, who was in 15th. I ended up giving Kevin Magnussen a 6, a little bit above average. He did outdo his teammate in the race, but he was way behind in the qualifying. If he had qualified better, who knows where he could have ended up if he stayed out of trouble, of course. And that's Kevin Magnussen, who is known to get into those little tips of the wing knocked and having to get pulled in, black and white flagged. Sorry, black and orange flag, and that getting pulled in for the issues on his vehicle last year. So if he can stay out of the race, out of trouble on that race and get up there, maybe he will be in contention. Who knows? And then we come into Logan Sargent, who ended up qualifying in 16th, where his teammate was 15th, so just ahead of him. He worked his way up to 12th, and his teammate was 10th, so just a few spots ahead of him. Being a rookie on the grid, I think he was doing fairly well in that regard, and I ended up giving him a 7. So a little bit above average. Getting worked on that car was pretty surprising for that Williams, so hopefully they can continue that, and that's not just a fluke on that Williams vehicle. So, and then we get to Yuki Tsunoda. Yuki Tsunoda qualified 14th, ended up 11th, and when his teammate ended up in 14th. His teammate qualified 19th, so way behind Yuki. So Yuki was doing fairly well, so I ended up giving him a 7.5 rating, just above Logan. I think that Alfa Romero, sorry, Yuki, that Alpha Tauri was a better spot than that Williams vehicle. So I think he should have done a little bit better job. We will see how that works out in the future. So that was Yuki Tsunoda with a 7.5. Then we have Alex Albon, who qualified 15th and ended up 10th, whereas his teammate was ended up in 12th and qualified just behind him. So he did make up 3 spots in the grid in the beginning, but kind of stayed out of trouble, which is always good. I ended up giving Alex Albon a 8. So he fairly well job on that Williams vehicle. We'll see if that is an underrating or not as the season progresses. And we have Pierre Gasly, who qualified 20th at the very back of the grid, but ended up all the way back up in the 9th spot by the end of the race. So he had a really good race, and his teammate ended up 18th, which was way back into the race. His teammate outperformed him on the qualifying by quite a bit, making it all the way up to 9th. So I couldn't give Pierre Gasly all the credit in that procession, because he should have qualified much better than he did, which would have given him a much better shot during the race to even get higher in the rankings. So Pierre Gasly, I gave an 8, so he did a fairly good job. I couldn't give him a 9 or a 10 because of that qualifying performance that he had. Then we have Valtteri Bottas, who qualified 12th, ended up 8th, with his teammate was 16th. His teammate qualified just behind him. Bottas did gain 4 spots on the start, did a fairly good race, stayed out of trouble, but was not significantly in the limelight, as all of the racing was in front of him caught the cameras. So I didn't see a whole lot of Valtteri, but I did think he did a fairly good job, so I ended up giving him a 7.5 score. Then it comes to George Russell, who had a little bit of undercut, tried to do that for Stroll, but in the race, he did qualify 6th, just behind his teammate, just ahead of his teammate, who Lewis Hamilton qualified in 7th. So he did outperform his teammate in the qualifying, but then dropped behind him in the race, because he ended up in 7th spot when Lewis ended up in 5th. So didn't do so good in the race, but outperformed him in the qualifying. I gave George Russell a 7, so he did a fairly good job in that Mercedes, who doesn't quite match up to that top field in this season. Who knows what they can do if they make changes to really get themselves bumped up into that top field. Then we have Lance Stroll, who qualified 8th, ended up 6th when his teammate ended up 3rd. So he's a little bit behind Fernando on the end results. He did end up a little bit behind him even on the qualifying. So he didn't do as good as Fernando Alonso. But with those wrist injuries of broken wrist coming back, thought he did a really excellent job in that. I didn't like the fact that he was racing, because if he got into trouble, he might have done a lot more damage if they got in a tussle on that first lap. But luckily, he stayed out of any incidences throughout the race and was able to do a really good job, with that broken wrist. So I ended up giving Lance Stroll at 9.5. Not quite the 10, just because I'm not sure if he really should have been racing, but he did everything he could with that broken wrist, almost up to his teammate. So we'll see how he performs once he gets his wrist back into full health. Then we have Lewis Hamilton, qualified 7th when his teammate qualified 6th, just ahead of him. He ended up all the way up in 5th. He had a nice fight with Alonso during the race, did an excellent job with that Mercedes, but just couldn't quite make it all the way up to the top. I gave Lewis Hamilton an 8.5 because the race matters more, of course, than the qualifying session. So manage those tires and try to pull anything he could out of that Mercedes. Getting close to the podium, but not quite. So we'll see how that proceeds. Then you have Carlos Sainz, who qualified 4th, ended up 4th. His teammate ended up in the back of the field in 19th because of that DNF of that engine going. His teammate did out-qualify him, so that was something. So he couldn't quite get the perfect score in those regards. So I ended up giving Carlos Sainz an 8.5, along with Hamilton. Kind of got up there, stayed out of trouble, did as much as he could, got as many points as he could in that regard. So hopefully that Ferrari can eke out some more performance to get closer to those Red Bulls in the future. Then you have Fernando Alonso, qualified 5th, ended up 3rd. His teammate qualified 6th, so he out-qualified his teammate. Ended up, he's qualified. His teammate ended up 6th overall in the race instead of 3rd. He did out qualify his teammate from when he qualified 5th, and his teammate qualified in 8th. So outperformed his teammate, even though his teammate had those broken wrists all week long, and just really performed really well in that Aston Martin. So we'll see how that proceeds in the future. He did a really good race. I gave him a 10. I don't think he could have done much more in that vehicle. I mean, the qualifying was his only drawback, qualifying back behind the Ferraris, but that's a hard ask to get ahead of them on the qualifying and in the race pace. And then we get to the top 2. So we have Sergio Perez, who qualified 2nd, ended up 2nd. His teammate ended up 1st, of course, and qualified just ahead of him in 1st. Didn't do a super bad race. He did really good in the sense that he came in back into that 2nd position. He didn't have the greatest start, but he ended up able to pull back into that 2nd position and stick it there behind his teammate, even though his teammate was fairly far ahead of him. I gave Sergio an 8, so not quite near the top, but still a fairly good race for him. And then, of course, Max Verstappen qualifying in 1st, ending up in 1st when his teammate was 2nd in qualifying and in the race. Just basically ran away with it. He couldn't do anything else with it, so I gave him a 10. So there's only the 2 10s in the field of Max Verstappen and Fernando Alonso. It's hard to give him anything else more than that on a 10 scale, but that is how that proceeding goes through. In the future, I will try to give a little graph to see how things progress and see how well the averages of my ratings are for them throughout the year. So we'll see you next week for the race. Until then, we'll see you on the grid. Thank you.